Let's take some of the things that we've covered so far and apply them to an actual web page. Here I have a web page and I've already styled some of the things. This contains the small screen layout of my page, so I've already established the rules that I want at the small screen. Currently I'm not using any sort of columns, but what I'm going to want to do is when I get to the larger size, I'm going to want to switch this to a multiple column layout. Let's look at our HTML to start off with. Here's the page that I'm currently using. Because I have significantly more CSS, I've gone ahead and created an external style sheet, which we'll be using for this exercise. The HTML is pretty basic. I have a main tag that wraps around everything, followed by an H1. Then I have a section tag which wraps around the additional content on my page. Within the section tag, I have 3 divs, and within each div, I have an H2, an image tag, and a paragraph tag. This is what my page currently looks like with this content. You can see at certain widths, I have some issues with the H2s and the images, and that's because of the floats that are being used, but once we finish our styles, we'll take care of these issues. Let's look at the CSS I have so far. I'm bringing in some Google fonts. On the HTML element, I'm setting a background image, and I'm setting it to cover and a height of 100%. My body tag has a font family declaration. I'm setting the background color on the body tag to be a 70% white so the image doesn't interfere with the content that I'm putting on top of the background image. I have some margin, width, and min height settings. Then on my H1, I'm styling the font family of Zilla Slab. I have font size, font weight, line height. I'm setting the background color. This is this section of my page right here. So this is the blue background. It also has a partial transparency. I'm using a border on the bottom, setting text color, padding, margin, aligning the text center, and I'm using a drop shadow on the text so that the text stands out a little bit better. Then I have the section tag, and the only thing I'm doing on the section is adding 15 pixels on both the right and the left. And this is just to ensure that my section isn't getting pushed right to the edge of my page. Then here I'm selecting the divs that are direct descendants of the section, and I have some padding set on those as well. Then I have a rule on my section div H2, and I'm just styling the font, setting some colors, and setting a margin left of -65 pixels. The reason that I'm using this is because I want to make sure that this gets pulled over to the left. Without the margin left of 65 pixels, you can see that the rest of the content is going to be indented too far. So I'm pulling this out by using the -65 pixels. Then I have a rule for my images within the section divs. And again, I'm using that margin left of 65 pixels. The reason I'm using this negative margin left is because I'm using a padding of 80 pixels on the section div. So I want to pull these elements back so that they aren't indented on my page. Then I have a rule for the articles, and I'm just setting the margin and the padding on those. And then we have some rules on the section paragraphs. I also have a media query, but so far I haven't put anything in my media query. Okay, let's get started with creating our multi-column layout. In order to set the multi-column layout, I'm going to have to add some rules inside of my media query for Flexbox. We'll start off by making a rule for the section tag. On the section tag, I'm going to use a display of flex, which turns this main section into a flex object. Now at this point, if we refresh and our page is wider than 700 pixels, you can already see I'm getting the multi-column layout. Instead of leaving this display of flex inside the media query, I want to show you another feature of Flexbox. So I'm going to actually cut this out of the media query, and we're going to put this in the default mobile first portion of our website. So currently, even at the small size, my layout is going to be in 3 columns. Sometimes you might need to have flex turned on for whatever reason at a small screen. You can go ahead and you can use the flex direction property, and you have a couple of different options available. Instead of having the elements render vertically, you can go ahead and you can specify the value to be column. When you do this, if you save and if we refresh in the browser, you can see I go back to my original layout. Now it doesn't matter how wide my screen is. This is always going to appear in the one column layout. The advantage of placing the media query up in the mobile first is I no longer have that issue with the headers interacting with the floated elements above. You can see that no matter what size I'm at, we no longer have that issue. Prior to adding these two rules, there was a certain point in my layout where the images and the headers had some issues. If I add these two Flexbox rules back in and save, and we refresh our page, you can see that those problems are immediately resolved. Now that we have the Flexbox turned on in the section, but we're not impacting our page, let's go down into our media query and let's add some of our media query rules. The first thing I want to have happen is on my section tags, I want the flex direction to be changed. I want to have them appear in multiple columns. So we do that by specifying the flex direction to be row. And as soon as I do that, if I refresh in the browser, you can see at the small screen the page remains, but as soon as I get to my media query, my content now appears in multiple rows. Next, we're going to overwrite some of the padding that we're using. So I'm going to make a rule for section greater than div, and we're just going to set the padding all the way around to be 18 pixels. As you can see, my text is indented in a strange way underneath the images. Once I set this to 18 pixels though, all of the content kind of gets pushed over. And again, this is fighting with some of the other rules that we've specified. In order to get this to work in the way that we want, I'm going to add a flex basis property, and I'm going to set this to 0. This is going to set the measurement of these items based on the main parent container with the display of flex. So now my columns are going to be the same width, but they're not going to take up all of the available space. We'll also add a value of flex grow, and I'm going to set this to 1. Here we're applying the same value to every one of the div elements inside of the section. They're all going to have the same value, and they're all going to render inside of that section element with the same width. Now the column width should be equal even when the browser is resized. Let's save and check this out. It does look like my columns are now equal width. Let's get rid of this weird outdentation that we're experiencing. In order to do that, I'm going to make a rule for my section div h2. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to get rid of that negative margin left. I'll go ahead and I'll set the margin left to inherit. That's just going to set it back to what the browser would have it set by default. While I'm at it, I'm going to do the same thing on my image tag. So we'll go ahead and set the margin left to inherit here as well. I'm also going to change the size of the images. So I'm going to change the height of the image to 3.5 ems. We have a rule above that's setting the height of the image to 5 ems, so we're going to make them a little bit smaller in our multi-column view. Now when I refresh, you can see that the images are slightly smaller, they're not being outdented anymore, and now our columns look a little bit more even and equal. And that's pretty much all we need to do for this particular exercise. You can see that I can make my page very wide, and the columns are going to just continue to get as wide as they possibly can. They're going to display in a nice equal layout, and then of course when my layout gets smaller than 700 pixels, my page is going to switch to a one column view. In this way, we're applying quite a few of the lessons that we've learned in the previous Flexbox videos.